starting.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
We know we have a few more people that's going to be joining, but we want to be respectful of time, so we will go ahead and get started. And love it if you guys could stay muted, and then also just to make sure that we've got enough bandwidth for everyone, feel free to turn your camera off. But if you do have a question, love for you to turn your camera on and so that we can kind of see you and where the question's coming from. So thank you for working with us here, making sure that technology works for all of us. We've got quite a few folks that's going to be joining us this morning. So welcome to the introduction of the stormwater planning, kind of part one of a two-part session. If you haven't registered or not aware of the second part, please drop us a chat and we'll make sure that you get the link for part two, which is going to be tomorrow at the same time from 10 to noon. I think we're going to go ahead and kick this off with introduction so that you know who we are on our end. And I'll start off since I'm here. I am Bao Chung Tua with the Maohai Flood District and glad to be here to speak to all of you this morning. Jess, how about you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jesse Clark with Stream Landscape Architecture. Nice to see you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brent Caslon with Valerian, and I'm a planner.
I'm Ryan Taylor. I'm a project manager with Moeller Engineering Company.
Troy Thompson with Ecological Resource Consultants.
Mary Powell, Environmental Manager with the Maohai Flood District.
Well, thank you again. We all going to go ahead and start with learning objectives. Just want to make sure that we hold true to what you're going to be walking away with today. And so three primary learning objectives this morning. The first is we do want you to understand what we mean when we talk about urbanization. Jess is going to give us a kind of a deep dive in what we mean by urbanization and how that results in changes to our natural landscape. The second part is we do want you to understand how the natural environment responds to urbanization. You know, when people move into an area, the landscape starts to change. How does that natural environment change? And what are some of the behaviors that you should be looking for? And last but not least, we want you to begin to understand how to mitigate for these urbanizations. This team of experts here is going to spend the rest of the session kind of speaking to that. And so why don't we just start off with maybe Jess, could you give us kind of an overview and a little deeper dive in what we mean by urbanization, because we use it a lot.
So really, you know, for decades, the basis for stable stream network has started with hydraulics and hydrology, and only more recently have we really started to consider other things like vegetation and geomorphology and all these other things to understand how a healthy natural system really works. But it's really only, you know, in the last couple of decades that we're having the realization that we're all living here together. These are all places that we've developed as habitat. And this is really at the core of understanding that community values associated with our infrastructure and in the strategies for managing the effects of urbanization to make meaningful places while we enhance those streams and natural systems. So, you know, I usually will ask people to raise their hands, and so I'm just going to ask you to mentally raise your hand here. But, you know, is urbanization something that's important? And do we want our towns and cities to be better places? And really at the core of this question is, do people think they want more people in our towns and cities? And most people, when you ask them out on the street, they'll say they don't. They'll often say things like, oh, it's too crowded, it's too congested, I'd rather live with a lot of open space, etc. Go ahead and go to the next one, Terry. But the truth is, you know, we want to share our really nice places with our friends, with our neighbors, with people across the world, really. We're interested in sharing, you know, the great restaurant that you live by or the nice parks. And we basically brag about those nice places. But, growth requires better infrastructure. And that better infrastructure enables growth. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. So we're always building better energy systems. We're worrying about better transportation. We're dealing with better communications, worrying about how we can deal with water management, whether it be new water supply, whether it be our sewers, our stormwater, et cetera. Essentially, all of these systems work together to create our urban infrastructure. Next one. And so if you've never seen this before, hopefully this is animating for you all on the end. This is called Newton's cradle. And essentially it illustrates Newton's third law of motion, which is that for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And in this case, I like to use this to illustrate one point, and that is that our action in this case is urbanization. Our reaction is managing nature to deal with and accommodate that urbanization. So in our urban areas, our human reaction is really managing nature. And in this case, we're talking about streams. And we're talking about managing nature to protect ourselves, to provide better healthy areas, safer areas, to protect our infrastructure, our homes, our buildings, et cetera, and to protect the environment to make sure that we have healthy resources as we move forward and for our children and grandchildren. So in our urban areas, we have to ask ourselves, is this kind of infrastructure that we've got on the screen, is this why people come to these places? Is this representative of those things that we brag about, that I was talking about earlier, where we're saying, oh, you got to come see this? And go ahead and hit slide in. The truth is that the density of humans, that's urbanization, has really created that need. The only reason that we're managing our streams is because people have developed habitat in these natural areas. So I like to use this. This is called the urban transect, and it was developed by a pretty famous planner that most of you may have heard of, Andres Duany. And I love this exhibit because it really illustrates at a basic level how we think of urbanization in urban areas. To the far left, T1 is that natural zone. It's really unused primarily by people. It's all natural. When you get all the way to the far right, that's our ultra urban core. This is where you've got a lot of streets, obviously less vegetation, more people are living in these areas, you're going to have more infrastructure, et cetera. And everything in between there are these just different gradations of urbanization. And so I like to start this whole conversation with a definition of what urbanization is. The first part of urbanization is this idea of more people moving into an area. So that's where that T1 through T6 really starts to illustrate higher density. The second part of that definition is in the ways in which our society adapts to the change. And so when you look at the further right, I'd like you to think about, as we move forward to this, what kind of changes do we see happening as we move further to the right in that cross section? And we'll go back to this cross section more. But again, wanted you to think a little bit about this. And so we're going to try and get an idea of where people are operating and working within this environment. So I think we have a poll that we're going to ask you to participate in. And what we need everyone to do is, can they just click on this link too? No, they have to use your cell phone, capture that little QR code. If you would, we'll take a moment to let you log into that. And you should see the poll EV for Golden Pine 087. Is that right, Lauren? Okay. So we're just trying to get an idea of where are you working along the transect? Are you in more suburban areas? T2, T3, there we go. If we're seeing more people in those ultra urban areas, not seeing a whole lot of T5 and T6, a lot of T3 and T4. Great. This is really helpful. Can you scroll down just a little bit, Laura? Hit that C more. Oh, yeah. So there's some in that T6. Excellent. Great. This is just really helpful for us to know as we're moving forward through the rest of today's presentations and into tomorrow, sort of how we can help tailor some of this information. That's really helpful. Next, we're going to jump into the effects of urbanization. So if we didn't answer your questions, how are we taking questions in the chat? Or,
Yeah, is there any questions so far, Laura? That
these are all really high level introduction at first. We're going to jump back into this component a little bit more. We just want people to have an understanding of what the foundation is for the conversation.
And I didn't say this earlier, and I just want to encourage, I mean, this is intended to be a conversation. And so if there's anything that you want to chime in on, please don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. We do have someone monitoring. If there's a question that we want to draw up for this team of experts, we will do that. So we want you to benefit from this in a way to where if there's something that we say that either provokes a question or provokes confusion, don't hesitate to please chime in. All right. So, Jess has talked about kind of urbanization and is kind of that concentration of people moving into an area, but also with that concentration of people, how they habitat in that area. And as you can see, Derek, with the next slide is, I think it helps. I'm preaching to the choir a little bit in terms of this understanding, but for the purposes of today's discussion, I think it's foundational for all of us to be on the same page of when we talk about urbanization. Jess spoke to that. But let's talk about what does that mean in terms of kind of our watersheds, right? That's why we're gathered here today. And so as Jess pointed out earlier, when you talk about urbanization, we're kind of moving from that T1, kind of that natural environment, to kind of the T6 in this particular case of an urban core where you've got a concentration of people that's come in. So this is highly concentrated full of people. But we've also created a space for us to live. Well, there are implications to that with the natural environment. Let's walk through, and you'll see with this next slide, we'll walk through an example watershed. Some of you have heard me use this watershed in the past, but I think it helps to illustrate what happens to our watersheds when we do move from that T1, T2, and in this case, this is probably more in kind of that T3 to T4 range, where you're kind of in that suburban, you've got some urban elements to this. But this is a watershed. It's the Marcy Gulch watershed located near Chatfield Reservoir. It's just on the east side of Chatfield Reservoir, just south of C470, as you can see there. And you can see Marcy Gulch showing up in blue. In 1999 or in 1993, which is the earlier slide, and you can keep it here, Derek, you can see that it was fairly undeveloped, just literally 6 years. We went through a period of high growth, and we've seen that here in the metro area. 6 years where it grew very quickly, and with the exception of the areas on the very upstream side, it's generally fully developed. You can go to the next slide, Derek. And so I just want to say that with this particular watershed, it met the criteria at that time. Development did stay out of the creek. We gave a lot of space for Marcy Gulch so they could kind of swing left and swing right. We also put in regional as well as on-site flood control facilities shown there in purple. And so again, this watershed developed adhering to the standards at that time. But as you'll see in this next slide, is that by the early 2000s, late 90s, we started to see some erosion surfacing on Marcy Gulch, which resulted in infrastructure at risk shown here. And with the next slide is as the channel lowered, and Troy's going to speak to this here in a little bit, it lowered first, and then it widened and it started to stretch out. It started to threat property, both public, being public infrastructure, you've got trails, you've got utilities, but it also started to threaten private property. You can see the homes, although they are set far apart from the creek, they are still close to the creek. And you'll see in this next slide where, and yeah, we saw these early symptoms early on, but in 2010, everything kind of came to head, and it came to head in this area shown in red after a significant period of rainfall. And you'll see in this next picture, we basically lost the channel. And with the channel, what happened is with that storm, it cut down and it widened, and it resulting in a channel that really was no longer prepared to continue to convey floodwaters. And you'll see in this next photo that a lot of infrastructure was lost related to this. The Highland Canal is kind of that flume that you still see standing, although it was damaged and wasn't operating as a result of the storm. You'll see in this next photo that we did lose vegetation because of this incision. You can go to the next one with uprooted trees, and then the next one as well. And with this event, it moved even closer to kind of private property. We did take action and address this problem, but this is the watershed responding to increase in density, more people, and increase in how people is creating habitat in the watershed, which brought in more driveways, more rooftops, more roads, more imperviousness, which means that Marcy Gulch, which didn't experience many flows in its historical setting, now was seeing flows with every summer thunderstorm that was coming through. And you can see with this next photo here that this really came to head. South Platte River kind of told us the story of Marcy Gulch, because you can see the chocolate milk there at where Marcy Gulch ties into South Platte River. In 2005, you start to see some chocolate milk, which is an indication of mobilization of the sediment due to erosion in the Marcy Gulch watershed. You progress through the next two slides, Derek, you'll see that chocolate milk in 2006, and then in 2008, very significant. Again, some behaviors of this watershed telling us, hey, I'm changing because the watershed's changing, and I'm changing, and actually I might not be able to handle the conditions that I'm put in. And so this next two slides, you know, some of the things that we think about with floods, I just want to kind of point out two ranges. There's the range of events where we experience it every summer. Our typical summer thunderstorms, we all experience it here. We know what those are. And when you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight that with Marcy Gulch, the green is what it historically saw as a peak discharge for a typical summer thunderstorm. In other words, it was very unnoticeable. The minute you put roads in, more driveways, more rooftop comes in, the peak discharge related to a typical summer thunderstorm increases 50 times. And this is just in peak. It also occurs more often. It also occurs longer. It also occurs more year round than it did before. And this is why the watershed changes result in the stream responding, is because now it's seeing a condition that honestly it never had experienced before. These are the summer thunderstorms. If you go to that next slide, you'll see for those events like 2013, 2015, last summer where we had a lot of rainfall in May and June, those floods that impact or cause harm to property, or those that are life safety issues, those, as you can see with this next graphic, goes up twice. And so comparing the green kind of to the red is those events go up significantly as well. And that is why our streams in urban areas are kind of finicky. They're a little bit sensitive. And that's because they are now brought into an era where they haven't experienced this in their geologic past, and now they're having to adapt. And so I think with that kind of as the foundation of talking through urbanization and what that means, how the natural environment starts to respond to that urbanization, I think most important and why you're here today is let's talk through, well, how do we prepare our watersheds for this change? Because this change is going to happen. How do we help it prepare, and how do we mitigate for these changes? And so I'm going to kick this off to you, Mary, I think, to talk through that.
Okay.
Do we want to pause and answer a question that came in really quick?
Oh, yeah, please, Laura.
So Cody wrote in that climate change, development standards, lack of master planning were the results of Marcy Gulch purely due to the increase in impervious cover, or were some other mechanisms at play? The results seem drastic for the size of the watershed.
Yeah, I think, and good observation, Cody. I think for Marcy Gulch, there was a master plan that we had followed with that particular watershed. I think the one thing, a couple of things, and if Jim Williman were here, I'm going to be Jim Williman with Muller Engineering for a little bit. I was very intentional in saying flood control facilities. You know, the practice at that time was really peak shaving. In other words, you're reducing the 100-year. We're lucky if we're hitting the 10-year. I don't think that actually in this watershed we have 10-year. We have basically 100-year flood control facilities, which meant that we were managing the 100-year developed condition back to the 100-year historic condition. But any events that were smaller than that were allowed to be increased. So your 10-year was significantly higher, your 2-year was significantly higher. And so Marcy Gulch experienced those larger events for the smaller, more frequent storms. And the one thing that we did mitigate for was the 100-year, but that wasn't enough. So that's part one. And that's why we now have full spectrum. Full spectrum detention is where we are managing all of the events to its historic or existing condition. That's part one. Part two of the answer, Cody, and I think you probably suspected this in kind of what I spoke to, is that the approach for Marcy Gulch was regional detention, some grade control structures, but we generally stayed out of the gulch, thinking at that time that we were doing a gulch a favor, but not going in and putting in a lot of armoring and a lot of structures. And what we learned from Marcy Gulch is it's a sandy system. It can't handle a lot of water. And even though we're providing detention or flood control for that 100-year, we're allowing all the other events to hit the system raw. And without much infrastructure in Marcy Gulch, it unraveled. And we have learned from Marcy Gulch, and that experience with Marcy Gulch has informed our standards today. And Cody, if I didn't touch on your question completely, don't hesitate to chat, and we'll continue to build on the answer here. Any additional answers, the group here, especially Troy, that you want to add
one thing I would add is that in that process of the Marcy Gulch, we looked at those graphs that talked about the peak flow rates. What we really didn't talk about is the flow volume. And so, as Bowes had indicated, for some of those summer thunderstorms, we're maybe increasing the peak flow by 50 times. That's just the peak flow rate, but the volume of water in an undeveloped type of an area or watershed, you might not get any runoff for storms up to certainly a quarter, maybe even half an inch. And now with all the imperviousness we have, is we're getting runoff from those very frequent events. And in all of those, when we get even to a point where the streams would have historically flowed, we have so much more volume of water that's coming in. So it's all of that energy that's being added to the system. Certainly with the question on things like climate change, we're going to have to figure out how to factor those in, whether we're in a spot that means we're going to get more intense rainfall events, meaning more runoff. Those are things that moving forward, we're certainly going to have to continue to look at in more detail and consider. But from an urbanization standpoint, really, it's the way we're changing the hydrograph there that probably is maybe much more significant than the types of climate change we might see in at least the near future.
And I'll just add, because you triggered a thought, Troy, is that we spoke to peak, we spoke to volume. The other thing we need to give some thought to is the regularity to which the Gulch is experiencing these flows. And I would say for Marcy Gulch, you take a 2-year event, right? Or a summer thunderstorm event. Some of those flows in the historic undeveloped condition probably didn't even make it to the Gulch because they were evapotranspirated, used up by vegetation, or they infiltrated. And so the creek never experienced a flow. So guess what? With detention in place, every time it rains, the Gulch sees water. And those are all the changes that we're speaking to that really puts havoc on our systems. But really great question that promoted good conversation, Cody. Encourage everyone else to continue to do so. We want to make sure that this is interactive and beneficial. All right, Mary.
All right. Well, in recognition that we had to make some changes in how we addressed urbanization and the effects on the stream, the district really put a lot of thinking into how can we do this better. As Bao alluded to with the Marcy Gulch example, at the time, we thought that the answer was, well, just don't encroach on the floodplain, give the 100-year event plenty of room, and the creek will be fine. And obviously that wasn't the right solution because, again, as Jesse mentioned earlier, as soon as we start having an effect on the stream, we have to manage those effects. And what we've realized over time is we're trying to manage towards this new idea about higher functioning, lower maintenance streams. Derek, go ahead. Certainly one response that we can do is more of a reactionary response. And this is like, well, if we're going to see some response from the stream, let's nail it in place with some hard structures, some hard engineered structures that really focus on getting the water from point A to point B out of the system as fast as it can, as a way to manage those storm flows, et cetera. Structures like this that you see, obviously it's through a very urban area. There's some homes on either side of this. The real focus on this was flood control and reducing risk. Again, getting the flood water out of the way. These types of designs tend to be a little bit reactionary. If they're seeing some problems back in the day, this is probably from the 1990s, this structure that we're seeing. The real focus is, we see instability, we can't have that. And so we nail it in place. And these types of solutions are very much focused on addressing hydrology and hydraulics. That's the H&H in the slide that you see there. So it's kind of a one-dimensional response to stream management. And the district recognized that over time, structures like this hardened structure, when they fail big. And it's very expensive, of course, to build them in the first place, but then it's very expensive to maintain them over time. And so the district started focusing more on, sorry, I tried to change the slide myself. Luckily, nothing happened. So we started to try to look more from a systems perspective at our streams, recognizing that they're very complicated, there's a lot going on. So we really wanted to get a better understanding of the stream system itself, not just the water flowing through it, but really understanding and planning and managing our urban streams differently. And so what the approach that we're trying to use now, and that we hope that you'll appreciate and maybe bring into some of your practice, is embracing that complexity and the context of the stream so that we can provide multi-benefits to the people in our communities. It's not just a way to get the water out, but maybe it becomes an amenity, it's open space, it's wildlife habitat, et cetera. So to do this though, and this is where, sorry, I'll go back. It's okay, preview. Here we go, thank you. To do this though, we really need to be proactively planning and managing our systems before they turn into a Marcy Gulch situation. So that's what we're really trying to stress here today with you all, with more of a planning focus as the audience here. And that is, we have to be proactive. We also, this last part is how we do it. We're talking about the high functioning, lower maintenance streams. That's the HFLMS. And we look at that through the lens of 5 elements of stream function, which you saw as a preview. And here they are.
Nice sound effects.
The district came up with, we looked at a lot of different stream function systems and approaches, and we recognize that, at least for our urban streams, the 5 functions of streams that we wanted to focus on are community values. We still need to focus on the hydrology and the hydraulics, but we also need to focus on geomorphology. And Troy here is going to speak more, I think, to that in a bit. But the geomorphology is really a piece that was lacking in the past, not understanding that complexity of response that occurs to the new stressors. And then finally, vegetation as a very important aspect of stream function, and ways that vegetation can work in projects that hadn't previously really been considered. And so I think the first...
Do you want to touch on the honorary 6th element? Mary just mentioned that in preface to Brent, the multidisciplinary team.
Oh, sure. Well, a great way, thank you, nice segue. As part of recognizing this new approach, we recognized as well that in the past we had engineers on design teams and a lot of planning teams that focused on the H&H. As soon as we started talking about community values, geomorphology, vegetation, we very quickly recognized that we needed to bring more people to the table during the planning process, during the design process, and even during the construction process. And so that recognition really led us to stressing the importance of high functioning teams as well, not just streams, but high functioning teams through a multidisciplinary approach. And Brent is going to take you on that journey here now. Are you
Later,
ready?
later,
Yes.
later.
Later, he's.
Later.
I'm gonna talk about it later. I know.
I'm sorry.
It was a really nice segue. though.
It was. I had in mind for later.
Yeah, it was really nice.
What we're going to do right now is take a little break.
Do you want to do it now, Laura, or do you want to wait?
Whenever you guys, we're only half an hour in, so if
Oh,
you guys
yeah.
would like, we can go a little bit longer
Yeah,
and
let's do
straighten
that.
a bit.
Sorry, no break for you.
Well, or we could see if people have any questions.
Oh, yeah, let's
do
Thus
that.
far.
And if you need
That
to
was
take
a
a quick break
quick-
while we answer questions, obviously go ahead and do that. But does anyone have any questions so far?
Put them into the chat or.
Yeah, we're happy to
Or
get
raise
you
your hand.
Raise
Yeah.
hands.
Any questions?
I love it.
Even just give us some notification that there's still people out there listening.
Some thumbs up.
Oh, there we go.
There you go. Thank you.
Oh, there's a raised hand.
All right.
David Anderson had a raised hand.
Good.
I love all the love.
There's a couple raised hands.
There are some raised hands.
Do we have
That was an
some-
accident, sorry.
Oh,
I meant
do
to
have
clap.
Adam
had a question?
Go ahead and just ask Adam.
I think you can unmute, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Might have just been raising hands as.
Oh, okay.
Oh, maybe.
as support. Okay,
Yeah.
Lots of love coming in.
Great.
Thanks,
Right.
Jeff.
Having this.
Appreciate the.
Well, we can continue. I mean, I can blab a little longer, you know. Those of you who know me know that that's not difficult. Watch it. Okay, go ahead and go to the next one, Jeff.
Want to turn your camera on?
Camera on. At least I'm muted. All right. So I love this. I love this image. This is right around the National Western area. You can see the old wastewater plant in the foreground for Denver there. Now, you know, this area has changed. I think this image, I want to say it was in the 30s. And I love this image because it illustrates some of the points that I love to make about urbanization and about how our drainage infrastructure adapts. And of course, there's been a lot of press around the South Platte River these days. Some of you out there may be even working on this area of the river now. But, excuse me, what I love to see here is this is again illustrating that definition of urbanization, which is the first part is you've got more people moving into an area. And the second part is how we adapt. How do we manage our world around us to adapt to more people? And so you can start to see things like roads and railways, and in this case, all of the stockyards in the foreground. So what does that do? Well, we've straightened our rivers. You can see in the foreground, we've channelized and straightened, we've smoothed things out. We've completely changed the way the South Platte River, in this case, was working. And so that means that we are adapting our natural world around us to help us with the urbanization. Yeah, go ahead. Go one forward. There you go. We had clicker for all of you out there in the audience. We had clicker problems out there. So Derek is our official clicker here. Thanks, Derek. You do a great job too. But again, going back to this idea, and you can make this one quick, but the idea that the more we urbanize, the more we're managing, and the more we manage, the more we urbanize, because people are attracted to that, and it just kind of cycles into this loop. Go ahead to the next one. And so we wanted to start to really think and highlight this idea that our infrastructure is important beyond just a single function. And I love this image because, well, first off, maybe just in the chats you can answer here. What do people think the average lifespan of our drainage infrastructure is today? When we build drainage infrastructure, what's the average lifespan? And I'm going to give a couple of seconds here for people to respond. It depends. Yep, good. 25, 30.
50 years.
I see a 50, 40, 30. Nice. Excellent. You guys you're in there. 30 is the closest, to be honest. Yes, there is some infrastructure that can survive 50 years, But let's say it's 50, just to be, positive about this. For most of us, 30 to 50 years, that means that we're designing our infrastructure to last one person's career. That's it. One generation is what we're designing our infrastructure to last. And a lot of that infrastructure is designed to do one thing. It's designed to get water from one point to the next. It's designed to get water from the pipe into the river. It's designed to do one single thing. And so what we need to start doing is thinking about that, how our adaptations can make our places better. And by doing that, we have to make infrastructure that lasts longer and that actually enhances the places that we live or enhances urbanization. The second point I'd like to make about this slide is that we're often asking these questions about, well, could we make it look nicer? Could we make it a nicer place for people to be? Could we make it do something for our water quality or our air quality or our noise quality? Could we do things that make our places better by making our infrastructure better? And a lot of times we get told these are added value. Well, if we have money, we can do this. Well, if, so on and so forth. So we've started to really take the perspective of these are not added value. These are essential values. And if we don't think about our adaptations to our infrastructure as essential values in the way we enhance our urban areas, we're not doing things the right way or not doing things in a way that can really benefit society in the best way. Go ahead to the next one. I usually have an even longer rant on this. Okay. So we use and we hear the term placemaking often. Many of you have probably used this in either asking, can we do a better job with, or something else that really adds to the idea that we're enhancing these places. But I like to think of these as this is a solution that considers these 6 or 7 things. Certainly these aren't perfect. Certainly there sometimes are more, sometimes are less. We're always balancing these things. But I like to use this list of 7 things as a good starting point. Consider it the filter that you should be just asking yourself when we're starting to think about planning for our drainage infrastructure. And the first is very simply, context is king. Everything around us matters. The way we look at our architecture, the way that we build our roads, our trails, the vegetation that we're implementing, how we're treating things around us. So does our infrastructure actually enhance the context of where we are inhabiting these places? Number 2, how many of you have worked on some kind of a master plan? I bet you every single one of you have worked on a master plan or a vision plan or a concept plan or something that is adjacent to the work that we're looking at. And so we always should be thinking about how our new infrastructure improvements are working towards a vision. Is it improving the quality of life? Hopefully this is not a new concept to you, but we always are thinking about, again, how can we take something beyond that single function of moving water from one point to the next? Economic development is a really interesting one because I think many of us think about economic development in one lens, and that is, if I build it, will they come and spend money? Therefore, building my taxes higher, so on and so forth. But economic development really starts to think in a different lens about the cost that you put into something now and the generation of more, better. It is also revenue, but it also has to do with that context thing. Economic development often helps provide more equitable conditions for those who need help in terms of living in more equitable conditions. I love this celebrating engineering point because it really is at the heart of when we think of civil engineering, civilization, that is civilizing nature is engineering things. And so we're constantly reminding ourselves that when we're building something, we're really celebrating better design. We want our things to be more sustainable, more durable. Again, I love to see infrastructure that has lasted thousands of years, like Roman aqueduct bridges that allow people to cross, carry water. They do all kinds of things, and they're a symbol of pride. The last point I think is really important in that we can be designing our surroundings and our built environment to really encourage people to have pride about where they live. Remember those first slides earlier that I was talking about where we're bragging about our neighborhood or our restaurants? These things can really actually be reflected in our infrastructure. Next slide, if you would.
Could I just
Yeah,
chime in on one thing,
please do.
Jess? Going back to that slide again. Again, just trying to connect the dots and build the thinking as we're progressing through this. And so we've talked about what it means when a group of people or concentration of people move into a watershed. That actually changes in that natural environment. And we've seen the flood district, and I will always put us on the spot as leading the way on how to do it. And we did it for 50 years, very well or poorly, depending on the angle you're coming from. But, for a long time, we looked at the systems of moving water from point A to point B, which means there are two things that we cared about: hydrology and hydraulics. And, Mary spoke to, we're making this evolution, and this is the flood district. Yes, we're talking about place making as it relates to a flood district conversation. And I hope that all of my public work colleagues out there, you'll do the same, is that in order for us to create more sustaining infrastructure, we do need to embrace what Jess is talking about. And Mary spoke to this, and that's why we've moved from really reactionary to systems thinking, because the infrastructure we put out there isn't just for moving water. It has such an impact on the fabric of the community, to what Jess spoke to. And so this is the first element as a part of our transition to creating more sustainable infrastructure, is thinking about the community value. And I'm going to probably say it wrong, Jess, because it's probably inferring it's not value added. It should be just a part of our thinking. It's not anything that you throw in extra. It should be the very first thing that we start with. And I just wanted to emphasize that point as we're talking through this, is kind of doing a little bit of the mental math for all of you.
Absolutely. You're teeing this slide up perfectly. What we've been really trying to do is get people, for a long time we were talking about this as being the creed of stream management, and it's that human interventions are for infrastructure. They're adaptations that complement and enhance urbanization. That is what we're doing. We would not be managing our streams. We would not be managing our drainage infrastructure if it were not for us, people. And so that whole idea that these are not added values, they're essential, is very, very important. So you can move on to the next slide. This is probably another one where I have bigger wing. So we have a series of polls here. We wanted to get some ideas from you. Laura, I'm going to go through these really quickly.
Oh, okay.
Never mind. It's okay. I can do it on here. That's fine. So the first question, I'll let everybody jump in here. This one is related to, okay, so we're going to go through the idea of program, context, and stewardship here. The first question is really related to program. And so I want you just to think about, what are the favorite things that you do in your community? What's your favorite thing to work, live, play, whatever? And we've got this neat little word cloud that Laura designed. It's probably going to be awesome.
It's going to
Check it out.
it already looks
Bike, walks. People like to be outside. Climbing, fishing. I mean, every one of these is outside, right? These are fantastic. So then go to the next one. So the next one is about our context.
Poll is full.
Oh, the poll is full. Oh,
Apparently we have a cap on the
sorry, everybody.
respondents.
Well, guess you got to jump on it faster. Just kidding. Just kidding. We need to fix that. What are your favorite things about the places that you like to do it? Water. Wow, look at that. Green, water, open space. Did you cap it at 6 people?
That's slightly more than 6, but yes, if you want to get in quick.
The great thing about a word cloud is that we hope that it represents a lot of people's thinking. So what I wanted to point out on this one, some of the characteristics are things like quiet, green space, plants, those kinds of things. They're really important, right? And these are the kinds of things that often get value engineered out. So when somebody says the most important thing about their place is green, water, open space, nature, those are often the things that get value engineered out. So it tells us again that these are the things that we ought to be focusing on rather than cutting out because of funding.
One thing I want to add here too, Jess, is water. All of our cities are built with water in mind, meaning the Platte, was the reason for Denver, right? That is why we have the city where it is.
Confluence, yeah.
It's right at that confluence, and that's and people are drawn to water. I think that's something that's
It's a characteristic of most major cities.
most major cities. Yep.
So, okay. So the next one is about stewardship. Hopefully. There we go. So what kind of things make us want to take care of those places? And my guess is that it's going to be related to the fact that you want to preserve those very characteristics that you just described. Community, nature. Laura capped this one at 2 people. just kidding. Kids. Yeah, community,
Kids.
future generation, right? Yeah. It's really nice to see that because again, what you're doing is you're essentially validating that all of this stuff that we've been spewing is true. People value people. People value nature. People value their community. So these are the things that make us want to take care of it. That's our stewardship. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide if you would. Let me get that teed up. Okay, so the last few slides here, I'm just gonna do a very brief overview. Go 2 more. 1 more. Right there. Perfect. Thanks, Derek. So I call this, and you're going to hear the word framework probably used in a few different ways, but I like to call this the framework for integrating community values with stream systems. This is really an important way, and I also want to apologize. Some of the colors came through really funky on my slide generation, so it might be hard to determine these, but I like to use these 3 buckets as a matrix for things that you're balancing when you're considering how you're planning for space, how you're designing for drainage infrastructure, and how we're essentially implementing urban infrastructure to carry water through our communities. The first is that idea of context. The second being scale, how big or small, and the third being program. So go ahead and go to the next one, Jake, if this works. Okay, good. So context really speaks to a lot of things, right? And I want us to start thinking about it's beyond just roads. It's beyond just about how we get through it, although it includes that. So transportation, access, circulation, these are really important things. People like to move from one place to another. It's also about our architecture and aesthetic. It's about the materials that we're using and the forms. I recently just got back from Cuba, actually, and I can tell you that there are just some amazing contextual cues in Cuba. Despite the condition of much of its infrastructure, there are these beautiful aesthetics that really inform all of their infrastructure. And that leads to the demographics, right? A lot of different people using our places. So it's important to consider how we're using land use, density, what kinds of things are already there. Existing program is a really important one for us to consider when we're developing new infrastructure that might support or feed into that existing area. Next one. So when we're talking about scale, we can think about scale in a lot of different ways, right? It can be related to just the waterway, whether it's a 0-order stream, it's this tiny little trickle, or it's all the way down to a large river. But we can also start to think about scale in terms of our demographics, in terms of our development patterns, right? Rural, suburban, and urban or ultra-urban development. There's a completely different scale of both the objects in space, buildings, the scale of our roads, the scale of our infrastructure. All of these things are important to consider when you're thinking about whether we're planning for space, right? Are we reserving enough space for all of that to happen? All the way down to the details of every nut and bolt or finish of the concrete that we're talking about, or the craftsmanship of the masonry that develops into a wall or an outlet structure or something like that. Okay, next one.
Can I just add a point there, Jess?
Please do.
I know working with my Denver Park friends, as well as my Adams County Park and Open Space friends working on projects, especially along the South Platte, this question of scale comes up a lot because I know, like in Adams County, the question of, okay, we're doing an improvement to the South Platte River. but it might actually be considered a regional park.
Mhm.
You know, it's a regional destination. And so therefore that informs, you know, and here we're talking about a stream restoration project. We're having this conversation of what is the purpose of this improvement. And it's going to be a regional park and open space. And that informs the type of amenities that we might want to include to make sure that we're meeting that marker. And so I think that's what, to your point, Jess, where scale comes in. I know, like in the South Platte River, in the Denver piece, I know with my Denver Park friends, that same discussion comes in, is it might not be a regional location, but it might serve as a neighborhood park, an open space, which informs, again, the scope of design. So I just wanted to illustrate what that point means, even when it starts out as a stream restoration project. And that's typically where it starts out, but I just love the conversation that Jess takes us in, is really, what is it first and foremost to the community?
Yeah.
And it's not a stream restoration project to the community.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that I know we're going to touch on this more later, but the number one thing that we're seeing related to scale, it's not enough space. We're not giving enough space to this kind of infrastructure so that we can allow for all of these other functions to occur.
Yeah.
If we don't allow for that, then we're already boxed in. And so I know we're going to touch on that later, but you go to the next one. Thanks. So program, we hit on this a little bit, but I also characterize this into 3 different ways: active, passive, and indirect. So active program, this is like you're actually bringing somebody to a program and you're actually asking them to act. It could be as simple as they're asked to do something, complete a survey, kick a soccer ball, whatever it is. You're actively participating. Passively participating in something is, I saw people were talking about birding, hiking, those kinds of things. You're engaging yourself into that area or that part of nature, but you're passively experiencing something. And then there's the indirect. It's almost like the piece of experience that you don't realize you're experiencing it, but it is still impacting you. These are things like, it could be lighting, it could be the smell, it could be the temperature, it could be, right? You could come up on something that just really doesn't feel good and you don't even know why. So these are just big buckets to think about program. Go to the next one, please. So lastly, I'm going to leave you with this. I really like the idea of taking this framework and using it to start to filter, again, using the word filter our ideas through as we're planning and designing for our waterways, to do things like these 6 bullets over here. We need to be providing equitable conditions. This is a really important thing for us to be considering as we're looking at our urban areas and as we're looking at both developing new urban areas as well as redeveloping old existing urban areas. Context and experience, again, we've talked about that, working towards a vision, supporting responsible economics. It means that we're actually thinking about economics not just from a first cost perspective, not just what does it cost to build it, but what does it cost to maintain it? What is it actually going to do for the rest of our community? Is it improving our health and well-being? Are we actually giving people a taste of nature, and are we giving them access to nature, something that is really improving their well-being? And lastly, is it resilient, sustainable, and durable? We're shooting for that infrastructure that lives in perpetuity, or at least lives beyond us, with some maintenance, acknowledging that no maintenance is probably not realistic, but we can do it. We can get there. All right.
And we are at the halfway point. Laura, is this a good time maybe to do that break that we talked about earlier?
And if people want to stay on, they can stay on. They can
Answer questions?
answer questions, but if people need to take a break for a moment, this is the time to do it. Okay, great. Thanks. You can entertain questions, I think, as well.
That's a good question came through.
Question came through: when and how to decide if we want to take the traditional method, channelize, concrete the stream, and take the water as fast as we can, or green infrastructure method, the low impact design or low impact development practices to control the overland runoff at the source. What are the driving factors to pick the right method?
Yeah, I can. So I can speak to that a little bit. And when we come back from the break, I've got kind of an overview of some of those initial hydrology and hydraulic conditions. But we're going to get into this, quite a bit tomorrow and then a little bit today. But it's this holistic approach. So hopefully, what you're taking away from this is, these 5 elements. And when you combine these 5 elements and you think about them holistically, that's where you're going to get that information from on whether your specific site context requires more of a channelized or piped approach versus more of a distributed approach, spreading things out throughout the site using more green infrastructure like that. And so, we'll get into a little bit more, but a lot of it from my mind, because I'm a water resources engineer, a lot of it comes from starting to think about where is water going on the site. When it does rain, when we do get those larger events like Val was talking about with Marcy Gulch, where is that water going to go on site? What are the natural drainage patterns of the site? And then how do we, effectively manage that so we're not, creating an additional burden on the downstream receiving waters or downstream users, things of that nature.
And I'll just add on to what Ryan spoke to. I think the thought here isn't that you as a single person, whether you're the project manager, the project designers, that you don't need to have all the answers. And I think that's why Mary hinted at this multidisciplinary team is not one person is going to embody all of the expertise with the 5 elements. The intent here is that as a project manager or project designer, if no one's doing that, you should be the one doing that. And making sure you bring your team together and asking that question exactly that was asked is this approach of low impact development, is this approach of managing water at the source appropriate for the site? Or are there other driving reasons why we do need to get it just to point B? And there is not a right or wrong answer. It's really about having the conversation and making sure that all of the disciplines are represented and creating that tension, as I call it, that push and pull of where it's appropriate and where it's not. And just to maybe take it one point home, when Jess is talking about program, I know that talking to my open space and park friends, there's always a little bit of you're going to put program space into a space that's going to get flooded from time to time. That is the kind of tension that we want, is we're going, that space it's free to use is this, and you're going, but that's not going to be accessible all the time. And that is the tension. That's the push and pull that we want to have on these projects, so that sometimes we could say, it doesn't get flooded often enough to where it might be appropriate for a football field, to where it's going to get flooded enough to where we don't want to put playground down there. I think that's the point.
Yeah, and Mary really stressed, lower maintenance. I think that's something else to keep in mind. Low maintenance is relative, right? It's relative to your site context. It's relative to the goals of the project, to the available space you have. And so, maybe there is a project where the lowest maintenance solution for the stream or the drainage is a pipe or channel, because that meets the overall project objectives. It meets the most community goals, things like that. But what we're trying to get across is that should not be the first option, right? You really should get your team together, start with the planning process that I know Brent is going to go into later today, and really bring all those experts into the room from the very beginning, to start that, sort of brain dump and that thinking process of what can we do with the site and the context of building.
It's all about we call it the knobs and the levers a lot of times, when you turn one knob, you turn that one up, maybe you're going to have to turn another one down a little bit, and you're prioritizing which one gets the most volume. I'll date myself. We used to, in the 80s, we used to have these equalizers, and you had, 10 of these slider things. Remember those? And you'd go up and down, and I don't know, I'd love to think that it would sound good with all of those 10 all the way to the top, but it doesn't. It sounds good when you start to tweak all the different frequencies and get it just to the right place. But then you might switch, sound genres, for instance, and you're tweaking it again. So the knobs and the dials and the levers all need to work in unison to really help prioritize. That's a great question, whoever asked that, for just teeing up how you really make that balance.
And the other part of that too is, I think you just touched on it, Jess, is not every song is the same, right? So every project is going to be different. Right.
And that fine tuning
is
going to need to be done every single time.
Yeah. there's no one-stop solution for any one site. Just like,
That's why they give you those memory buttons. You got,
Yes.
like, equalizer setting 1.
You're really dating yourself
man,
now.
I'm going down.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
One thing I think I would add to it, the question was sort of when do you pick the more natural versus the more engineered channelized is, and we'll get into this in a little more detail later on, is when you do make that decision, I think it's very important to know the consequence of that decision, particularly if you go down that more engineered channelized, because typically what that means is you're giving up space. And as things develop around that space, it is very hard to get that space back.
Yep.
And so to me, that's kind of a really big thing to keep in mind, in addition to sort of all of the other, the context and those types of things, is what might the future tell you, or maybe things that you don't know now that you're precluding yourself from if you make a decision that you're not going to be looking at more of a higher functioning type of approach.
There was a person in the chat who brought up how the important vegetation is as well to that, and referencing the Marcy Gulch example was a great example to kind of clearly see how fast things went. The more and more vegetation got lost, trees, shrubs, grasses, and other plants really do provide an amazing strength and resiliency for streams and green places. And that once we lose that, degradation happens almost instantly.
Yeah, right on.
you got it, Joanna.
You got it, Joanna. Totally get it. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but for sure it is a trade-off. And just kind of what Troy and everybody else has been mentioning is some of the ability of vegetation to work for us depends on how much space the stream system is given and what the risks are. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but in some high-risk settings, you may not really feel comfortable getting the vegetation to be your major line of stabilization. So again, there's always the question, the push and the pull of what's going to work best. There was another question or comment I wanted to just get back to, and it's from John. John notes that some of the driving factors of our decision making are the city's comp plan, its zoning and land development code, its property owners' right to develop, et cetera. And I think we all recognize that those can be obviously very set and whatnot, but I think prescriptive. I think what we're hoping out of some of our work here and hopefully getting you guys to think about this stuff is that we maybe start adding flexibility. You know, when we do start at the comp plan, let's start thinking about these concepts and zoning. You know, maybe we need to have some changes that occur with our approach to zoning. So we're hoping, and I'm sure Val will get to this, I think we're hoping you'll be some of the agent of change to kind of work us toward that eventuality. So,
and kind of on that same point, we're going to be talking a lot about that tomorrow as well, with how planning, you know, how the planning process works, but then also, you know, all of those things that kind of set up how a property is developed. And so we'll go into a little bit more about that tomorrow, and I'm sure that there will be questions because, again, every municipality is different in the way that they do this planning process. But tomorrow we'll be a little bit more in depth on a lot of this stuff.
And there's one last comment, just really speaking to the point that development is a big driver behind storm sewer and how a lot of these open channels are driven underground, just due from a development's need for additional houses, more lots, more space. So that's definitely on theme with what we're discussing.
Yeah, and I saw that comment, and that's a great comment. I have some examples tomorrow when we start going through some of the more detailed information about how, you know, we can work with that really, and how we can still achieve those lot goals, those experiential goals, the development goals, while still using this approach.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that point too, Ryan. I think that we can really meet the needs of everyone.
Yeah.
I think the key is just everyone participating in that conversation. Mm-hmm. But we have proven that it works.
Yep.
We've got a model of it being constructed now that proves that it works. I just wanted to to my developer friends to say that, yeah, we understand, we're working with you, and I think that we can get to the same place and not have anyone draw that short straw.
And
Well, yeah, not only does it work, but it makes it better.
Makes it better.
I mean, that's
It
really
makes
the message.
money. Let's just say it. It
Yeah.
simply does. It does make money because what you've talked about, Jess, is that return on that investment.
Yeah.
It is in dollars.
It's in dollars, it's in quality of life, it's in health, it works.
and a lot of those projects are really, creative projects that people, like to go to. That creates that sense of place. Then also, we keep harking back to it, but that multidisciplinary team is where a lot of that stuff can be hashed out and new ideas can be, brought together to create something that's magical.
And there was just a question real quick. These are being recorded, right? And we'll share these or post them somewhere.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Ryan. Right. All right, Ryan, since
Okay.
you're talking.
Yeah.
Come on in.
Yeah, hopefully most everybody's back. So like I mentioned, what I'm going to touch on is really sort of a high level hydrology and hydraulics. I know, the people participating in this webinar, there's quite a broad cross section of people here. We've got planners, engineers, architects. So what I wanted to do was go high level over this because I really do think that it's sort of the basis of everything that we've looked at so far with the issues on Marcy Gulch, with some of the things that Troy has talked about so far with the stream corridor, and he'll get into in a little bit more detail here. And then with what Jess talked about, really the hydrology of your site and the hydraulics are really going to somewhat dictate what you can and can't achieve with the community, and then how you integrate the community aspects into that can help drive your analysis. So we'll go to the next slide that has a water balance. And this is, probably a refresh for, if there's other water resources engineers or engineers in the room. But this, I really wanted to, just highlight from a very high level, the water balance, that everybody's familiar with. You get precipitation in a condition like this, which we're going to call the natural condition, with a lot of vegetation, trees. That precipitation is then, captured through interception on the leaves or depression storage. If there's little, undulations within the environment, you get that depression storage. Evapotranspiration is another big one where the plants use the water and then it evaporates through their leaves. Infiltration is a really big one with natural environments. I forget who said it, but when you get that precipitation and it slows everything down before it gets to a stream corridor. It's infiltrating that water, it's providing that deep percolation and groundwater recharge. But I think in the case that we're looking at today, it's really about the runoff. And that surface runoff is reduced when you have this pervious area. So you don't have to answer these questions in the chat unless you want to. But these are kind of the things that as a water resources engineer, I'm sort of thinking about, when we start looking at a development or looking at a project. Where does that precipitation go when it falls on that watershed? And then how can the planning process utilize this concept? And this is where, that multidisciplinary team and getting all of these other experts in the room, that question can be answered. So then when we transfer, we start looking at urbanized areas, what are the results of urbanizing an area? You have that same precipitation, you have reduced evapotranspiration and reduced depression storage potentially because you don't have the vegetation there. When you start covering the landscape in concrete and these impervious surfaces, you're reducing that potential for infiltration, evapotranspiration, all these things that end up slowing down the surface runoff. And then on the flip side of that, all that precipitation then turns into surface runoff. And that's where, as Troy mentioned earlier, it's not just the peak flows, but it's the volume, right? You start getting the increased volume for smaller storm events, and then you have to really manage that increased flow. And so you can see it in this photo, what the channel form had to take on. It's a lot more rock, it's a lot more structure, and it's a lot more, stabilized banks versus the last photo we looked at, which was, purely vegetation.
If I could just make a point, just to connect it back to Marcy Gulch, Ryan. So I think this is a great slide because if you recall from Marcy Gulch, the difference in that 2-year event or that summer thunderstorm event was 50 times the peak discharge.
Yep.
What we're essentially saying here is that all of that water that used to go into evapotranspiration, into infiltration, now is direct runoff into the gulch.
Yep. Yeah. And, the other thing I wanted to mention here was just to bring it back to what Mary was talking about was the reactionary versus the systems approach. So a lot of times, the first thing that we do, as part of a master plan or part of a hydrologic study is you take your, existing impervious values, existing land uses, figure out what those flows are, and then you compare that to what your proposed condition or your impervious land use values are. And a lot of times, the first gut instinct is to say, okay, now I've got an increase in X CFS. I'm going to size a trapezoidal channel. And then that's sort of that reactionary approach. And Troy will get into this a lot more than I will. But I think that's, something to keep in mind. It's very easy to sort of take that easy route. And what we're saying here is really to take that step back, bring in those experts and figure out how to implement all 5 elements that we're looking at. So if we go to the next slide, what we can talk about now is considering the stream network. And so the photo here is just an aerial of Castle Pines area. And this is the yellow lines are representing the subwatersheds. The blue lines are the existing channels. And what we're going to start talking about is really this stream network and the stream corridor. And then how do we plan for that using what we call a dendritic approach? The dendritic approach is kind of like the photo on the left. It's kind of like a leaf where you have sort of the main stem of the leaf. You have all these little fingers that sort of spread out into the watershed. They all collect and convey flow to that main stem. And like we've seen with Marcy Gulch and others, if you start cutting off those small branches to just leave a main stem, you're reducing the benefits of the overall watershed. And so what we'd like to do is talk about how do you make room for that stream corridor? How do you reduce, the structural elements from storm sewers, concrete, riprap, bank stabilization, and how do you actually work with the environment? Go to the next one. This is that same photo, but this is when it's partially developed. And so you can see what this area is turning into and what the watershed is turning into. And one thing that we were able to do here, which is really great working with the developer in this case, was preserving those stream corridors and utilizing the topography in this area to help with the drainage. And so those blue lines you can see are generally undeveloped, and we've kept those in place and modified them as needed to, convey those future storm events and work with the development.
Brian, those
yeah.
are mostly intermittent or ephemeral streams,
Yep.
right? So the point being they weren't just overlap graded.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these are intermittent streams that generally only run when they see storm events. But like Troy mentioned again, the frequency of those events are now going to increase. We've got the increased impervious area for the roads, the houses, the developments. And so the next thing when you start thinking about the stream corridor itself is that horizontal shift. And this is what Troy mentioned about allotting the space for that stream corridor. But then the next step, if you go to the next slide, is really starting to figure out or think about where that detention is going to be. It's easy to just put a large detention facility at the lowest point of the property and kind of put it out of the way. But at the same time, what we found is that actually leads to more consequences and more issues down the road, especially for the upstream system that doesn't have any detention. And what we've noticed in a lot of projects now is that being able to use that space for open space, for parks, providing that multifunctionality aspect within the corridors gives you that distributed detention, which then reduces your downstream flow rates, reduces your peak flows, reduces your volumes, things like that. So really, at the very beginning, this is sort of that approach of giving that space to the stream corridor, looking at detention, distributing it as possible, utilizing the topography that's out there, and then again, using the site context, the existing program, as Jesse mentioned, to help in the planning process.
I do just want to, and I'm glad that you brought up this example, Ryan, just to give credit that I will say that the flood district really didn't shape how this development turned out. The key player here was really the planner.
Mm-hmm.
I think the planner had the foresight to bring the engineering team into the planning process very earlier on. And they realized, and I would say give credit to the developer too, realizing to Jess's point is that there's a lot of beauty in this community that they wanted to leverage for marketing the community.
Yeah.
And so it was really the planner going, there's something here that is really free for us to use. It's free marketing. Let's leverage that. And then bring the engineer on board to say, hey, if we leave the space alone, can we do that and still meet all of our stormwater requirements?
Yeah.
And so I give a lot of credit to, again, the planner, and you're going to hear Brent talk about this. The planner is the key here in saying, hey, there's something here. And in order to make this possible, because I would say this is a challenging site to develop, but because they brought in their multidisciplinary team in early, they were able to have a conversation and have a path forward that, in my opinion, was still very cost effective. So just wanted to recognize those folks that contribute to the success of this project, and it was in the flood district.
Yeah, and from a marketing standpoint, actually, it helped phase the project. It helped us to determine, which channel was priority. It's hard to see on here, but there's generally one main entrance into this development, and so that's where the priority was. Let's focus on those streams that are going to be the first thing that you see coming out of this development. And it helped. I mean, I don't have the numbers, but it significantly helped with, sales, selling homes, things of that nature. So it goes a long way of including that planning process.
I'll kind of add to this a little bit as well, but from a planning standpoint, the developers a lot of times talk about their pro forma, and in that pro forma, which is, kind of making the numbers work, making these developments work from a monetary standpoint. You are using the existing stormwater system that nature gave you to do this, instead of adding in expensive concrete pipe, expensive riprap, all the things that go into developing infrastructure for these sites. Long term, and this is kind of where the district is, kind of focused too. But from a maintenance standpoint, going in and fixing a concrete pipe is so much more expensive than going in and having to replace a tree that fell in because a high flow came through. It's the difference between heavy infrastructure going back in and replacing versus a person going out with a skid steer or a mini excavator to repair these infrastructure items after the fact.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to Troy. But like I said at the beginning, this is a really important concept. Even if you're not the expert on hydrology and hydraulics, it's really important to know this, because then the next thing that happens is once you have an understanding of how water is being distributed throughout the site, then it comes down to those stream corridors that Troy's going to get into, and allocating that space and understanding from a geomorphic aspect where your conditions will change in the future.
We did have one quick question. Do you want to jump back to slide 60? Brian, they were asking, in this urban situation, did the solution I'll just read it. Did this urban site include a solution where capacity needed to be expanded among the other design goals?
So this is not a project that I worked on, but I like this question, because what this shows is there is no space, right? So if there was a point down the road where you needed to expand the channel, and you needed to expand the the channel here, you don't have the room to do that without then taking out some other amenity, whether it's the plaza space or, there's a little seating space over on the right side of the screen. So a perfect example, so I appreciate the question, is if you go this route where you're not allocating that space within your corridor, you potentially end up in a situation where you're now having to remove amenities down the road because of the change in condition or the impacts of urbanization.
And I'll just add, Ryan, that's why we also then end up with a lot of buried infrastructure, because you've got more water coming in. You still have to mitigate that water. You can't have more water come into like this creek here. That's where a lot of times we see underground detention crop up, because, well, how do we reduce the peak coming in so that we don't have a capacity issue at the channel? And so not having the right amount of space everywhere just compounds the issue, because now you end up with unnecessary infrastructure littered throughout your watershed.
Yep. Yeah. And Jeff asked, what about the depth of the channel? That's definitely an option, but you can only go so far, right? I mean, you can't dig out another 10 feet of this channel just to provide that extra capacity without potentially impacting something else, or then having to shift where you now have concrete walls. And then we're in the condition that Mary showed earlier, where it's a much tighter flood control system, and that's the only benefit that you're getting.
Yeah, and I would say that Jeff's question, that's definitely an it depends.
Yep.
Because could you? Sure. Enough money, you can almost do anything, I suppose. But there might be existing infrastructure underneath the channel, but you can't go lower. There might be experiential benefits that you're going to completely sacrifice by going deeper and narrower or having vertical walls. You might disconnect all of your vegetation from the natural hydrology, and so now you're either increasing the requirement for irrigation or completely obliterating any possibility for natural vegetation to exist. So it's, again, it depends. It's those knobs and levers that you're turning. And, are there examples of lowering the channel? Absolutely. We're seeing it here in Denver. The South Platte River in some places is going to be lowered 14 feet or something like that, right? But it takes a lot to do that and do it right, to do it where you're not sacrificing those things. And I think that's the point, is if you plan for having more space on the front side, you don't have to make those kinds of decisions, spend that kind of money, sacrifice those kinds of experiential or other infrastructure, et cetera.
Well, and I want to add, Joanna made a comment about kind of that, again, it's that double-edged sword of give it the space, but you still need to do things. And we definitely, even in the example, if you'll go to that next, to the development slide, one more. Yeah. Even on this slide, just so you know, there will be adaptive management done along these streams. One of the things the district is trying to work on is when we do get the space, we recognize that over time, additional stressors will be added to the system as development gets built out. But we're trying to come up with a way to only make those changes or protect those areas that are critical at the start. And then over time, we provide the opportunity to go in as things sort of, you can be a little more surgical in your addressing points of erosion. Instead of going in and redoing the whole channel the way we used to, we're going to wait and see how it responds and address things as they go. So all these areas, we want to make sure we're really clear. We're not just giving it space and letting it go like Marcy Gulch. We definitely have an adaptive management plan in place that says if we see this, then we do that. Maybe it's a riffle structure, maybe it's a bank stabilization. At some point over time, maybe the whole channel does end up getting redone, because that's just all it just can't do without all that work. But let's wait and see a little bit as some of our newer approach. So, yeah, that's it. Who's next?
There is one more question. Sorry. Do the planners, engineers account for the design storm event, the 25-year, the 50-year, the 100-year, when they do stream restoration?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we look at. and I think Troy, either today or tomorrow, you're going to get into this in more depth. But one thing that I'll mention about master plans, if you've been involved with one of those, from an engineering standpoint, it's really difficult to predict the future. With a master plan. Like I said, we have existing impervious values and proposed impervious values. But a lot of times what we're doing in a master plan is we're trying to provide guidance on what that channel may need. That doesn't mean that the master plan is the solution, right? And I think that's really important to keep in mind is when you're doing a master plan, you don't know what's going to happen in 5-10 years. And a lot of times these master plans, a new one doesn't get done for another 10-15 years, depending on the site. And so, understanding that it's guidance, it's not the solution, is really important. But those storm events are one of the primary things that we do look at.
And I just want to put words to or expand on the words that Ryan says regarding district master plans, is that we'll identify the problem and we'll identify the action or the intent to address the problem. How you get there is not prescriptive.
Right.
So we might say we need stabilization, but we're not saying we need grouted boulder stabilization versus a concrete channel. I think that needs to be left vague so that it can kind of be defined with time, because technologies and tool will change in time to create a little bit more of these planning documents that live on the shelf better. Thank you for bringing that up, Ryan.
All right, moving on to a different topic, geomorphology or fluvial geomorphology. And I thought maybe the first thing to start with is, what in the world does that mean? Granted, this is probably a term that many of you have heard, but for a lot of you, it may be kind of a new concept. But essentially what it is fluvial geomorphology is the study of how flows of water and sediment shape the stream corridors. So essentially, it really is something that's very important, because if we're trying to come up with designs that are not just so reactive in putting things in channels, we really want to know what the stream itself wants to do so that we can plan for that. If we don't consider that, we're oftentimes going to find ourselves more into that sort of reactionary type of approach. So what we have here is a stream corridor, a cross-section of the stream corridor that has some of the things that might be important. And we've heard a lot of discussions on different things that need to be considered. This just has some of it shown. The big concept is, from a geomorphic standpoint, is we want to make sure that we're providing the streams with enough room for the flows, the sediment that we've been moving through, and the associated functions. And as I had mentioned, talking up in one of the comment responses, this is really an important thing to understand early on in the planning process, because once you set a stream corridor, if it's too small, it's really going to be hard for you to regain some of the room that you might need for some of these functions. And with that, what I did is I took these 8, and there probably are 28 type of functions that you could come up with, but group them a little bit. So next slide, please. Let's see. Well, maybe we don't have it. So that's all right. We'll go through. Now I'm going to really make you strain your eyes, because a couple of these things. Oh, you're going to actually go back up for one. Yeah, no worries. A couple of these things are really related to hydrology and hydraulics and some of those functions that the stream would do. So with that, kind of in the center of the screen, number 1, stable channel, obviously that's something that is important. We want to be able to convey the base flows and the stormwater. Number 4, another one that really is more of a hydrology and hydraulic type of a component, which is slow down the floodwaters. So that's over on the far right. So having enough room for a channel and allowing it to spread out means that when you do get those big storms, there's going to be some attenuation. Here we go. Now, number 5 down at the bottom is promote the infiltration, the groundwater exchange. It's really important, maybe not so much for let's say, a safety of getting water away, but it really is a critical component related to what Ryan was talking about on ways that we can reduce some of the peak flows. Next, click forward, please. All right, now we have sort of a different category, and these are more some of your kind of environmental types of things. Over on the left, we have number 3, so creation of habitat for wildlife and aquatic species. Some of the earlier photos you had seen of sort of the reactionary concrete channels obviously aren't providing those type of functions, but really are important for systems that we're trying to create. In the middle here, number 2, support for wetlands and riparian vegetation. Mary's going to talk about vegetation a lot more, but obviously there's benefit from active, passive recreation, from just stability. And so if we need to provide the room to be able to allow that. And then down in the lower right, enhancement for water quality. That's really an important function of a natural floodplain. So the more that we can mimic those by providing room for streams to act like streams, the better off we're going to be. Advance that, please. And then lastly, we've talked a bit about some of the human element. And down in the lower left, number 7, provide room for, let's say, corridors and open space or parks or wherever that may be. Those are things that oftentimes are coexist with some of your stream corridors, a great thing. In the upper right, number 8, enhancement of property values, quality of life. Ryan talked about that on how by creating these spaces, we really are creating something that has not just sort of the aesthetic and emotional values to it, but there are some property values, quality of life type of benefits we get as well. So the big takeaway I would have from this slide really is that the room is required for a lot more than just conveying water, and the more that we can think about that in the planning process, the better off we're going to be. Next slide, please. Corridor width. So we're going to spend a bit more time tomorrow talking about this, but sort of as an overview, one of the things that just is important is coming up with a width of a corridor that actually provides for the type of benefits that we're trying to accomplish. This image happens to be from Cold Creek in Erie, and it's showing a planned restoration or improvement of Cold Creek that has experienced historically a lot of degradation. A couple of things that I would point out on this slide. First, you see the channel. That's the orangish shades of colors through the middle. And what we did with the design is we tried to come up with something that is very much not a trapezoidal concrete channel. We try to come up with a design that mimics what the natural form and function of a stream may be. And by doing that, you're having a lot of the benefits on the previous slide, the room for vegetation, the habitat, those types of things. And then outside of the channel itself, you've got the blue and green shades. Those are kind of overbanks. And in this specific image, what we're showing is how wide the flows will spread out in a 5-year storm event. And you can see what we're doing is we're allowing the water to get out, extend onto the floodplain, behave like a natural stream, attenuate flows, have that water sort of feed the vegetation that may be out there and enhance the riparian and wetland vegetation. But by having room, we actually have the ability for the stream to act like a stream. There's a nice alternative someone has in the chat of what you could do otherwise.
Brent. Trapezoidal channel.
Trapezoidal channel that we've all seen a lot of. All right. Next slide, please.
Actually, I'm sorry. Before, do you mind going back? I was just going to point out, Troy, I like your caption there that says we want to dissipate the energy so that we prevent failure. And I'm going to allude to that again when we get to the vegetation part, but it's that, what is the risk? Again, do we have enough room? By failure, does that mean a failure would result in damage of life and property, or is it failure would be a cut bank or maybe a head cut? So we do want to be sensitive to what we're talking about with failure, but the more room you give the stream and the more access to that overbank area in particular, you slow those velocities, that's where your vegetation is going to be able to be part of your infrastructure, more so than Brent's trapezoidal channel. The mode, what is that, bluegrass lawn on the top?
Yes,
That's what you get there.
It's so
Yeah.
great.
So thank you.
We've come a long way, so we're continuing on that journey.
Yeah.
Certainly. Next slide, please. And before jumping into this slide, I'll just say that in tomorrow's session, we'll start to talk a little bit more about how you might look at the room that might be required for some of the corridor width. But now jumping to a whole different topic that is very important from geomorphology is sediment regime. And what this slide, I like it because it's a good analog for what sediment is doing. Basically, sediment through a river system is kind of like rocks on a conveyor belt. And what this the takeaway from this really would be that every project you have, every stream that you're on is somewhere on this conveyor belt. So you're either at an area that is the origin of sediment. So this would be on the far right-hand side, which is the zone of erosion. Or you're in an area that sediment wants to pass through, that zone of transport, or the, go back for a second, or the far left, the zone of deposition. There we go. So what this is showing is what a zone of erosion might look like. Probably not like your typical City of Aurora zone of erosion, but what zones of erosion have is that they're typically headwater areas, higher slopes, even on these small first and second order streams, like we were talking about in some of the stream networks, you're going to have that. You're going to have an area where you start to produce sediment that would move into the system. You can advance it, please. You also will have areas that transport the sediment. So these are areas that generally aren't very erosive themselves, nor are there areas that are really showing a lot of deposition or response to that sediment. And these graphics are showing sort of the idealized, a mountain stream, but this is a type of area that, yeah, there's a lot of sediment moving through, but you're not seeing massive amounts of deposition or erosion. There'll be some of both of those, but generally the sediment is moving through. And then advancing, please. The zone of deposition. And so this is the area where you're actually seeing a lot of direct responses from your sediment. So the sediment that's being transported from upstream is going to be dropping out. You might think of alluvial fans, but you can think of those on very small scales as far as, in a lot of developments, the downstream end, oftentimes you're going to see areas that there's a tendency for sediment to want to drop out. And an important piece in planning is to just understand where you are in this conveyor belt so that you have a reasonable expectation of what the system is going to want to do. Next slide, please.
Do we want to provide a little space for questions? For anyone have something they just have to get off their chest before we move on?
I do just want to say, did someone chime in or was that?
Well, it might have been you.
Okay.
There was, but feel free to go on.
No, please.
Okay, there was a question asking on the stream channel width slide, are the green circles where the meander stream bends, are they riprap bank stabilization?
If you don't mind going back up a couple.
Green circle.
There we go. So yeah, what this sort of cartoon is showing what the different velocities are in the stream. And in this case, those green circles are actually areas where we have deeper pool habitats. So if you think of the walking along sort of the profile of the stream, that's a deeper section of the channel. We did find that on some of those areas, on what would be sort of the outside bend as the water is making its way through that corridor, we did have some buried void-filled riprap that was then planted. And then that's all part of sort of the balance of you want to make it natural, yet you need to make sure that it is controlled enough within the constraints that you're setting for it. So it was a combination of natural type, plan view, and profile of the stream with some engineered constraints to make sure that it doesn't just move beyond the limits of what we're allowed.
There's another question asking if the zone of deposition is typically the curvy part of the river.
Not in the context of the slide that shows the three different zones. Generally, that's thinking more larger scale, where you are correct that the tighter bends in a river, typically you'll have some amount of deposition that'll have occur on the inside of those bends and maybe some erosion on the outside. But sort of the idea of the conveyor belt is bigger picture. It's more thinking about you have some upstream area that's a source of significant sediment, some sections of stream that generally sediment is transferred through, and then some downstream areas that you get more deposition. And let's say in the thinking of the South Platte River, right through Denver is an area that historically would have been a zone of deposition. We've modified it so much by encroachment that now sediment essentially needs to move through that system. So it's become a zone of transport because of the types of modifications we've made to the system. So, but generally that the conveyor belt really should think about big system, not spot by spot as you progress, tens or even hundreds of feet downstream along the channel.
And I think you kind of addressed Rich's question with that response.
Oh yeah, right. And like everything, it's never clean. So there is where you'll have deposition, you'll also have erosion, and you see that a lot. And it's just even like the inside, the outside of a bend is a great example of that, where typically streams want to erode on outside bends. They want to deposit on the inside bends. That's the way the stream is transferring the energy and depositing material. So yeah, it's never as clean as you're only going to be eroding, you're only going to be depositing. It's obviously a more complexity than that.
There's another question. This is a hot topic, Troy. What is the recommended method to quantify the amount of erosion or deposition in a given channel segment?
Say the last part again, please.
It's up here.
Oh,
What is the recommended method to quantify the amount of erosion or deposition in a given channel segment?
So maybe I'll answer that slightly differently. Maybe the question I'll answer is, what is the allowable amount? And that really depends upon the design and the room that is provided. I believe Mary has a slide that comes up that talks about resetting equilibrium and what's allowed, the sort of the idea of things that are safe to fail. And so in that situation, erosion of a bank is, I think historically, as stormwater managers, engineers, any erosion has just been seen as a bad thing that we need to fix. And as we provide room for corridors, I think we can start to get away from that, and we can think of erosion of a bank as a stream. That is what streams do. And obviously there's some limitations to how much erosion we can allow to occur given the type of infrastructure that may be around that we need to protect. But one of the ideas of having these stream corridors, providing room, yet understanding your context, gives us the ability to say a stream is going to do what a stream wants to do within that, meaning it will erode, it will deposit, and as long as those things are not threatening sort of the infrastructure, dramatically impacting the floodplain, generally that those are things that can be acceptable in a lot of instances.
And then on the flip side of that, to Brian's point here in the chat, is deposition is not always a bad thing, right? Because you could have deposition that then provides the basis for what Mary's going to get into with the vegetation and wetland and riparian conditions, and then ultimately how those systems develop over time.
We're going to move on. stream is not an object, but a process in time, indeed. I don't feel like an object sometimes, but a process in time. Yes, I get over it. All right, vegetation. So we finally reached the most important and interesting parts. No, I'm kidding. But I hope you've noticed that we've been walking through each of the 5 elements very at a somewhat cursory level, given the amount of time we have with you today. But hopefully we're touching on things that make some sense and that get some thoughts going. Next slide, please. So with vegetation, again, I think it's been, I don't know. I remember in the late 1990s, the district, the Mile High Flood District, was really excited because they were trying to do something called bioengineering. And they had a demonstration on Clear Creek, upstream of the South Platte River. I think it was even upstream of like I-25 or 76. Anyway, they had this thing, this bioengineering test site, and it was a riprap groin, basically. It was this big, huge pile of riprap out in the stream, or maybe it's a weir. I don't know what you would call it, but it was big. And they had put willow stakes along the bottom of it. Yes, that was the bioengineering at the time. Was
we're so proud of it, Mary.
So willow stakes in the bottom. So this idea of vegetation as infrastructure, it's not new. It's not new, but I think we can all agree it's evolved over time. Certainly since the early 90s or late 90s, whenever that happened, we've gone quite a ways from there. And I do think it's because we're looking at the system as a whole. We're not trying to shrub it up, as sometimes Jesse and Brent and other landscape architects like to say. We're not trying to just come in at the end and greenwash it. We're actually incorporating the vegetation as part of the structural element when we're in the design process. So that's what we're kind of trying to speak to here. Next slide. One thing I think that's a really critical concept as part of thinking about vegetation, as opposed to the hardened, more traditional engineering design, is this idea about resiliency of our materials. And so the overall concept is fail safe versus safe fail. And on the left-hand side in state number 1, what we're looking at here, imagine that you have a little ping pong ball and you put it in a curved cup, and gravity always wants to make it go down into the bottom. That's its most stable state, is at the bottom of that curve. It's happy there. Now, if you're a piece of concrete, right, or a trapezoidal structure, you're sitting there, you're hard, everything's working, you're completely coherent, no gaps, no cracks, no nothing, and you will sit there for a very long time. Maybe as long as those Roman aqueducts, if nothing else happens. But that doesn't really how the real world works. But if you imagine trying to push that little ping pong ball up the side of the slope, you can do that, say, with high flows, or you have to have so much energy to really push that little ping pong ball out of its happy spot if you're a piece of concrete, such that, in fact, the only way you can really get the ping pong ball to move is if you break the structure. And then it's no longer in equilibrium, but then it's also no longer functional, right? There's virtually no recovery capacity with engineered hard structures. And again, I'm thinking concrete, because that's the best example of something where it's brittle. If you push it out of its happy state, it no longer functions. So sit with that for a second. And then we're going to, and so the great place to use that kind of engineering solution is in a place where you must have a fail-safe solution. In other words, it's going to do its thing until it is just absolutely pushed beyond its capacity. So a fail-safe structure you want to have, I don't know, on a dam, in some dams, right? Hoover Dam. All right. So think of it that way. The next system is the safe fail. And that's with vegetation. you actually have the capacity for different steady states. So the little ping pong ball at the bottom, maybe that's a certain type of wetland community. Well, if that little community is stressed in some way, maybe the hydrology changes, you can push the little ping pong ball up and over and it'll find a new steady state. So it may be a different type of wetland community, but it's still functioning as a wetland community. So it can undergo certain stressors and still either go back to its original state or it moves to a new state that is still functional. And these types of solutions are great when you have a little bit of capacity for this safe fail. If this system fails, there's not life at risk, there's not property at risk. So you have a little bit of flexibility with your system here. This very quickly is something to think about when you're using vegetation, is where do you want to end up on this line of succession? Obviously, this is a natural succession state. On the left is bare rock. Over time, it weathers, it turns into soil, the seeds come in, et cetera, et cetera. When we're doing our designs and we're coming in with our planting with vegetation, we're obviously skipping past the first left parts of all this. And we have to come in with a community that's going to function right when we put it in the ground and go hands off. So we do have to be thinking about where we are on this successional stage. And we also have to keep in mind that on the right-hand side, that climax community, that may not be where we want our vegetation community to end up. That may not be our highest functioning. And that's why we have to go back and reset the clock on the climax, the successional state with disturbance. We've removed disturbance from our vegetation system. We no longer have fire, and I'm thinking urban systems, no fire. We're trying to reduce floods. We don't have herbivory like bison and cattle and so forth to reset things. So we have to come in and reset it to our desired condition through maintenance and management of our vegetation. As Brent said, it's not no maintenance, it's low maintenance. So I'm going to clip through this. Do we have any really super pressing questions that have come up? Otherwise, we've got to have time for Brent to just dash through his part on the multidisciplinary team. Thanks.
Well, so multidisciplinary teams, last but not least. So, we talked about it already, that in order to get these projects done in a way, we need to have, a lot of people involved. I had a video that's coming up next, but I don't think we have enough time for that. So maybe we can figure out a time to do that tomorrow. That would be great. But if you go to the next slide there, kind of bringing it back to the 5 elements, each, if you think about, from a multidisciplinary team perspective, I would say you'd have one or more sub-consultants or consultants that are working on each of these factors in order to make a project really shine. And so you'd have a geomorphologist, you'd have an ecologist, you'd have a landscape architect working with you on community values. I'd say also a planner in that realm. And then you'd have an engineer that would maybe specialize in hydraulics and hydrology, your H&H, if you will. If you go to the next slide, so this kind of goes back to that video, but again, if you look at a symphony, there are 2 sets of violins. You've got one playing the harmony and one playing the melody. So if you keep clicking through there, Derek, you've got your engineer and your geomorphologist, I'd say. We're talking about our violins. Our viola would be landscape architects, and then we've got ecologists playing the bass. Another factor that we might want to include on this is our contractor. They're going to provide valuable insight into how our project is going to be built if everything that we are projecting says that it can be built. Constructability is a big thing. Leading the whole team is our project champion. And I like to think that a lot of times the planner is going to be really in concert, with this group. Singularly, each of these instruments sounds great, but together they really sound and make something really special. But before a symphony can play, you got to write the music. And John Baptiste is a great composer, so I had to include him. So if you go to the next slide,
Dancer.
he's such a great dancer. So we have our multidisciplinary team again, and I want to just talk about the planner's role in that. We talked about each of those elements having a member, so you can just keep kind of going through there. The planners, they write the music. They're going to delineate the space. They also guide this whole group through the development process as well. They ensure a multidisciplinary team is used, that be planners with engineers, geomorphologists, landscape architects, ecologists, and a contractor. We are, now really working together to make this happen. As far as, again, that planner's role is, we try to predict the future, right? With data, any of the tools that are allowed to us. And we try to project what, population is going to be. That's going to, taking into our comprehensive plan. But then, down to the site level, we're allocating space. And how can you prepare for a need that you don't necessarily see coming? 100 years ago, I don't think that they would have thought that the Platte would be channelized the way it is now. And so something that we just, try to think about. We can only do our best at this point, but knowing is half the battle. Lastly, so I just wanted to touch base on the next webinar, which is tomorrow again. We're going to go over the planner's role in stormwater function. Again, that development process, kind of a broad overview of that. Again, taking into account every municipality is different. And then stream management corridors and efficiency and design. How can we get this done? How can we get, and think about these systems in a way that it doesn't take away from the timing on a project, right? So when we start to all learn how these functions, work, again, in concert with your roadways, with all of your other infrastructure, how can we make it work in a way that is efficient? And I think a lot of it goes back to that multidisciplinary team. So with that, we still have about 3 minutes for questions, if there are any. There were some questions on vegetation.
No, I don't think so. Well, I answered one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being very interactive. The questions and the chat, the engagement with us does help to make sure that the content is connecting. Because if it's not, then guess what? Your time is wasted coming here. So we appreciate the level of involvement and interaction that you've provided.
One thing I'll say is I think that at the beginning of the class, there was questions about AICP credit and also just APA credit. And I'm going to be working on that going forward as well, and seeing if we can get some credit for what we discussed today, and hopefully for tomorrow as well.
And we should be able to also get, I'm glad that you touched on that, CFM credits as well for that. And so I think that we will use the registration as a means to communicate that you've communicate with ASFPM to get those credits. And we'll confirm with you. Right. Well, unless there's any additional questions, we will see all of you, if not most of you, here again tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.